What's the point of saving her? She's just another rich, old woman, right? Laughter echoed through the sterile room as the doctors and nurses moved around Melania Hampton, ignoring the power she still held. Melania Hampton, the 65-year-old self-made billionaire CEO, had built an empire spanning continents. But here, in the cold, sterile hospital room, she was no more than a frail patient. The machines beeped around her, and the medical staff went through the motions of their duties, treating her with cold efficiency. They didn't see her for who she was. They saw an old woman, weak, vulnerable, and invisible. In the corner of the room, unnoticed by the others, Casey Doherty, the quiet hospital maid, couldn't help but watch. She saw beyond the frail exterior, beyond the silence. What others overlooked, Casey saw strength, dignity, and an unspoken power that still burned beneath the surface. Melania's silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, a quiet defiance. Casey could sense it, and she knew, somehow, that what would unfold in the next few hours would not only change Melania's fate, it would change hers as well. The shift was coming. But before the story unfolds further, if you're feeling the tension, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Casey had worked at this hospital for years, quietly going about her duties, observing the inner workings of the medical system. But today, something felt different. Today, she couldn't ignore the injustice. The hospital was quieter than usual that morning, the kind of silence that felt thick, like it was waiting for something to happen. Casey Doherty stood just inside the door of Melania Hampton's room, watching the doctors and nurses move around the bed with the kind of casual indifference that was all too familiar to her. The staff passed Melania by, speaking to her as if she were just another name on a chart, another case to handle. Nothing more. Melania Hampton, 65 years old, the self-made billionaire who had built an empire worth billions, lay in the bed, looking fragile, like a small bird trapped in a cage too large for her. The machines around her beeped and hummed, each one another reminder of the fragility of her existence in that moment. She had been the queen of her world once, surrounded by power, influence, and wealth, but now she was just another patient in a sterile room. The doctors had already checked her vitals, said a few mechanical words to one another, and left without a second glance. Dr. Matthews, the lead physician, barely looked at her as he jotted down notes on her chart. The nurse, who had been assigned to her for the day, adjusted the bed and smiled politely, but it was clear that Melania's presence meant little to her. Just another elderly patient to be managed, not a woman of great power and legacy. Casey had watched it all from the corner of the room, holding her cleaning supplies, her heart aching as the scene unfolded in front of her. She had been here for 5 years, cleaning floors and dusting shelves, but today there was something about the way they treated Melania that didn't sit right with her. There was a coldness, a dismissiveness in the way the staff moved around the billionaire as though she had already been written off. Just another patient. Casey had seen it all before. Doctors and nurses treating the powerful as though their status made them untouchable. But here, in this hospital, power and money didn't mean anything. Melania Hampton, the woman who had conquered industries, whose decisions shaped the fate of millions, was now being treated like a disposable part of the system. Casey shook her head, but she couldn't look away. She had never been one to speak up, never one to rock the boat. In this hospital, she was just the maid, the invisible worker who cleaned the mess others left behind. No one took her seriously. She wasn't important enough to be noticed. But she noticed things. She saw how the world worked, how the powerful were sometimes blinded by their own superiority, how they overlooked those who weren't on the same level. She had always felt like an outsider, no different from the overlooked and dismissed patients she cleaned after. But today, something inside her was different. Today, she was standing at the edge of a decision she could no longer avoid. Then her gaze moved back to Melania. There was something about the older woman's presence that caught Casey's attention. It wasn't just the fragility, the way Melania's body seemed to shrink in the hospital bed. No, it was something deeper, something that Casey had been quietly aware of since the moment she first entered the room. Melania's silence wasn't weakness. Casey could feel it. There was a quiet strength there, an untapped power that hadn't disappeared, even in this weakened state. Melania wasn't helpless. She was simply waiting for the right moment. The same strength that had built her empire was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but no one around her seemed to see it. No one but Casey. The nurse came back into the room, checking Melania's bag and making small talk as if everything were normal. The staff moved around the room, their voices raised in hollow, polite tones. But the doctor, the lead one, Dr. Matthews, barely acknowledged Melania as he entered again, this time to adjust some of her medication. "How's she doing?" Dr. Matthews asked, flipping through Melania's chart without looking at her. The nurse shrugged, clearly uninterested. "She's stable for now." The doctor scribbled something on the chart and then leaned over to adjust the drip. He muttered under his breath, "Maybe she won't make it through the weekend." Casey felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The way they spoke about her, the way they treated her. They saw nothing but an old woman whose time was up. But Casey knew better. She had seen this before. People didn't understand the quiet strength that could still exist in someone like Melania, an intelligence and willpower that went beyond age or illness. Casey's thoughts were interrupted as she overheard the staff again, this time directly behind the door. "She's just another rich, old woman. Let's speed this up and get her out of here. The less she knows, the better." Casey couldn't believe it. The disdain in their words was undeniable. The assumption that Melania's life didn't matter anymore because she was old, because she was wealthy, because she wasn't a regular patient. It all hit Casey like a punch to the gut. Her hand shook slightly as she held the cleaning supplies. She stepped back into the room to find that Melania was still asleep, but her chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, showing that she was alive, still fighting, still strong. Casey's mind raced. What could she do? She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't supposed to question the medical team. But then she saw it. The prescription bottle on the desk, clearly labeled with Melania Hampton's name. It was meant to be in 4 dosage. Casey, with the practice she'd honed over the years of watching others, immediately noticed the dosage was far too high for someone with Melania's condition. Her heart stopped. Casey picked up the bottle carefully, looking at the dosage again. She knew it could lead to severe consequences, possible organ failure, even death. The error was clear. She wasn't imagining it. She stared at the bottle, feeling the weight of what she had just uncovered. What should she do? She had no medical training, no right to question the doctors. But this wasn't just a job. This was a woman's life. Her breath hitched. She could stay silent, pretend she didn't notice. Or she could speak up. But if she spoke up, there would be consequences. She knew that much. She wasn't sure if anyone would listen to her. No one ever did. She glanced back at Melania, lying there so still, so unnoticed by the world. Casey's decision hung in the balance. Would she risk her future, her job, to save a woman the world had already written off? Or would she remain invisible, just another bystander in a system that failed the people it was supposed to serve? Let us know in the comments. Casey couldn't stop thinking about the mistake. The dosage was wrong. Too high for Melania's frail condition. Too dangerous. But what if she spoke up? What if she was wrong? She wasn't a doctor. She had no training in medicine. She was just a maid, a nobody. The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest as she stood just outside Melania's room. She looked at the door, steadying her breath. The hospital had been her world for 5 years, her job, her routine, her place. But for the first time, it felt like she didn't belong here anymore. Not as the invisible worker, cleaning up after the real movers and shakers, the powerful ones. Today, she had a choice to either stay invisible or step up, to do something that could change everything. Melania's story had been built on more than just ambition. It had been built on sheer willpower. She hadn't been handed anything. Born to humble beginnings, Melania Hampton was a young woman with little more than a dream and an unyielding belief in herself. Her parents had worked long hours in a small family-owned store in a rundown neighborhood. Melania had been taught from a young age that the world owed her nothing. If she wanted something, she had to fight for it. And fight she did. She moved to the city at 21, determined to make a name for herself in the business world. At first, it was hard. No one took her seriously. They saw a young woman, barely out of her teens, with no connections, no family wealth, and a thick accent that marked her as an outsider. But that didn't stop her. She fought through it all, working multiple jobs, studying late into the night, refusing to let anyone define what she could or couldn't do. By the time she was 30, Melania had built her first company, a small logistics firm. The obstacles were relentless, but she never backed down. She reinvested every penny she earned, expanded her team, and soon, that small business grew into an empire spanning 3 continents. By 40, she was a name that couldn't be ignored. No one questioned Melania's brilliance, her strategy, or her ability to command respect in boardrooms filled with seasoned executives. She had earned every bit of her success, and she had done it alone. But now here she was, a woman who had once commanded respect from the world, reduced to fragility. The woman who had once led multinational corporations with confidence and authority was now lying in a hospital bed, silently at the mercy of a system that treated her as little more than a statistic. Casey's gaze flickered over to Melania, still lying motionless in the bed. The same sharp intelligence she had once seen in the business world still sparkled faintly in Melania's eyes. Despite everything, Casey could see it. The fire was still there, but it was buried beneath the weight of vulnerability. Melania's silence spoke volumes. It was a silence that commanded attention, not because she couldn't speak, but because she chose not to. Casey felt the weight of it, like a question hanging in the air, one that no one seemed to ask. What was Melania waiting for? Was she truly helpless now? Or was she simply waiting for the right moment to reveal her true strength? Casey felt a wave of empathy rush through her. Empathy for someone who, despite everything, was still holding on to a dignity and power that no one else could see. But Casey could. She understood it. For as long as she had been in this hospital, Casey had learned one truth. People like Melania were never truly seen. The doctors, the nurses, the powerful business people who came and went, they were all just like the staff that worked here. They saw the surface, but they missed the deeper layers. The true strength, the soul. Casey wasn't blind to that. She had learned to see what others didn't. Maybe it was because, like Melania, she had spent so much of her life being overlooked, dismissed, ignored. Casey had always been in the background, cleaning up after the people who thought they were better than her. But there was something different about Melania. She wasn't just another rich, old woman waiting to be discarded. She was someone who had fought for everything. And maybe, just maybe, she was still fighting. Casey's hands clenched around the chart she was holding. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her resolve was solidifying. She wasn't going to back down. The staff might have written Melania off, but Casey wasn't going to do the same. She turned toward the door, her thoughts racing. She couldn't just walk away and let the system take its course. Not this time. Melania deserved better. And Casey, she deserved to be heard. With a deep breath, Casey stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. It was time to speak up. She would confront the doctors. But there was one last thought in her mind. Would they listen to her, or would they dismiss her, just like they had dismissed Melania? Write your thoughts in the comment below. Don't also forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Now, Casey's heart hammered in her chest as she walked back to Melania's bedside. She had made up her mind. There was no turning back now. She took a slow, steadying breath, trying to calm the nerves that made her stomach churn. Everything felt magnified in the quiet of the hospital room. The sound of her breath, the soft hum of the machines, even the faint rustle of her shoes on the sterile floor. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, and her hands were clammy as she approached the bed. Melania lay still, her eyes closed. She seemed to be sleeping, but Casey knew better. There was something about the way she was lying there that felt intentional, controlled. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't just waiting to fade away. Casey had seen in her eyes when they first met, the fire still burning, just barely hidden beneath the surface. Melania hadn't built an empire through weakness. She hadn't faced the battles she'd fought to end up in a hospital bed, ignored and dismissed. There was more to this woman than the doctors could see. Casey had seen it all along, but now it was time to step forward. Casey reached out and gently placed her hand on the edge of the bed. The touch felt strange, like she wasn't supposed to be here doing this. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even someone who was supposed to make waves. She was a maid, invisible, quiet. But today, she wasn't going to be silent. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. "Ms. Hampton," she said, the words heavy in the air. "I've noticed something in your treatment. There's a mistake, a dangerous one." For a long moment, Melania didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, slow, and steady. But Casey noticed her eyes flicker, just the slightest movement, as if she were still listening, still aware of everything around her. It was that sharp gaze Casey had noticed earlier, eyes that still had the weight of years of decisions behind them, the same eyes that had once held the power to shape industries. Casey's palms were slick against the bed frame, her heart hammering faster now. What was she doing? She wasn't supposed to be here, taking this kind of risk. She was a maid. She had no right to interfere. Her mind screamed to her to back down, to leave the doctors to do their job. But her mouth betrayed her. "The medication they've prescribed for you," Casey continued, her voice low and urgent. "The dosage is too high for someone in your condition. I believe it could harm you." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their significance. Casey could barely breathe. She had never spoken like this before. She had never challenged authority, never taken the risk of speaking out, especially not in front of someone so powerful. She was just a maid, after all. Who would listen to her? But Melania, even though she hadn't said a word yet, gave Casey a look. It wasn't dismissive or angry. It wasn't the cold indifference that Casey had seen from the doctors. It was something else, recognition. Melania's eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, Casey felt like she was being seen for the first time. Really seen. For all the years Casey had spent in this hospital, cleaning and scrubbing the floors, moving in the background like an unnoticed shadow, this was the first time she felt like she mattered. Her words mattered. Still, Melania didn't respond. She simply continued to look at Casey, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and Casey found herself waiting, wondering if she had done the right thing, if she was about to make a huge mistake. Casey's mind raced, every worst-case scenario flashing before her eyes. What if Melania didn't believe her? What if she was just a troublemaker now, someone to be dismissed? What if the doctors, the ones with the power, turned on her? Casey's voice trembled slightly, as she tried to steady herself. "Miss Hampton," she whispered, more softly now, "I believe the dosage is too high. The medication could hurt you. You've been through too much for this to be ignored." Melania remained silent, her eyes never leaving Casey. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, like the calm before a storm. Casey couldn't help but wonder what Melania was thinking. Was she wondering if Casey had any idea what she was talking about? Or was she simply waiting for something more? The silence stretched on. Casey's legs felt unsteady as she stood there, watching the woman who had once commanded entire industries with nothing more than a look. And here Casey was, standing over her, daring to speak the truth when no one else had. Casey didn't know how long they stood there like that, in that charged silence, but the moment felt infinite. She felt like everything she had ever done, every choice she had ever made, every time she had held her tongue, every time she had remained invisible, was leading up to this one moment. And still, Melania said nothing. Casey felt her own uncertainty rising, her palms sweating, her heart beating faster in her chest. What if this was a mistake? What if she was wrong? What if she had just jeopardized her job, her place in this hospital, everything she had worked for? And then, finally, Melania spoke. Her voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Thank you," she said, her words slow, measured, but with an unmistakable sense of sincerity. "Thank you," Melania repeated, "for noticing." Casey's breath caught in her throat. Was that it? Had she done the right thing? Or had she just made a fool of herself? Casey didn't know, but in that moment, she realized something profound. She hadn't just saved Melania's life. She had saved herself. The door creaked open. Casey turned, startled. Dr. Matthews entered the room, his eyes already on the chart. He hadn't even seen Melania's gaze. He hadn't seen what Casey had just uncovered. And as Casey turned to face the doctor, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't done yet. Casey could barely breathe as she stood there, watching the door creak open. Dr. Matthews stepped into the room, his eyes already scanning the chart in his hands. He didn't acknowledge Melania or Casey as he moved to adjust the foredrip. The room seemed to grow colder, the tension hanging thick in the air. Casey could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, but she stayed rooted to the spot. She had done it. She had spoken up, finally defying the invisible walls that had kept her silent for so long. "Ms. Hampton," Dr. Matthews said, his voice laced with condescension. He didn't look up from the chart. "How are we feeling today?" Casey's eyes darted to Melania. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her gaze, something grateful, as if she had heard everything that had just transpired. Melania didn't speak, but her eyes flicked to Casey. The smallest nod, a simple gesture, but it carried weight. She had been heard. Melania's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Thank you for noticing." Her words felt like a soft but heavy acknowledgement, as if Casey had unlocked something she hadn't even realized was waiting inside her. The words hit Casey harder than she expected. She had expected no gratitude, no acknowledgement. After all, she was just a maid, right? But Melania's words pierced through the silence, reminding her of why she had done this. It wasn't just about the medication or the mistake. It was about doing what was right. It was about dignity. As Dr. Matthews turned to adjust the medication, Casey felt a sense of quiet resolve settling over her. It wasn't just the drug dosage mistake that had spurred her to action. It was the realization that Melania's silence, her power, wasn't gone. It was just being overlooked. But the relief Casey felt was fleeting. "You shouldn't be doing this," Dr. Matthews said suddenly, turning sharply to Casey. His voice was low but firm, laced with authority. "You're a maid, not a medical professional. You don't have the qualifications to question a doctor's orders." Casey's chest tightened. The words stung, but she couldn't back down. She had to stand her ground. "I saw a mistake," Casey said, her voice steady despite the tremor of nervousness in her hands. "The dosage is too high. I know I'm not a doctor, but I know what I saw. I'm just trying to help." Dr. Matthews' eyes narrowed as he set the chart down with more force than necessary. "Help? This is a hospital, not a housemaid's duty. We take care of things here." Casey clenched her fists at her sides, but she didn't flinch. The sting of his words was sharp, but the feeling of being seen by Melania kept her grounded. She was doing the right thing. Melania's voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Matthews," she said, her tone soft but clear. "Perhaps you should consider listening to her. I may not be in a position to understand everything, but Casey's opinion is valuable. She's the one who noticed the mistake." The room went still, the weight of Melania's words hanging in the air like a sudden shift in the atmosphere. Dr. Matthews' face reddened, and for a brief moment, Casey thought she might see him crack. But he just stiffened, his jaw tight, and turned to leave without a word. As he exited, Melania turned her head slowly toward Casey. There was a new respect in her eyes, something Casey had never seen before. It was as if Melania had been waiting for someone to do this, someone to see her. Casey stood there, her heart racing, but her spine straightened in a way it never had before. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a purpose. Her voice mattered. Casey's mind raced with everything that had just happened. It wasn't just the confrontation with Dr. Matthews. There was more at stake now. She had crossed a line. Casey took a deep breath as she glanced at Melania. She wasn't sure what to expect next. Would the doctors retaliate? Would she face consequences for stepping out of her place? Casey's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The door swung open again. A different doctor, this one unfamiliar, entered, followed by a nurse. "Is there a problem with her treatment?" the new doctor asked, his voice professional but sharp, almost accusatory. He was looking directly at Casey, clearly noticing her presence in a way none of the others had. "No," Casey said, her voice shaking but determined. "I simply pointed out an error with the dosage. Ms. Hampton deserves the proper care." The new doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse before speaking again. "We'll be taking it from here," he said curtly, as if dismissing her completely. "Please leave us alone." Casey's heart sank, but she knew there was no backing down now. She had crossed a line, and she wasn't about to turn back. She wasn't invisible anymore. As Casey left the room, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease in her chest. She had done the right thing, but at what cost? Minutes later, her worst fear was confirmed. A page came through on the hospital's intercom system, calling her to the administration office. Casey's heart raced as she walked down the long corridor, the familiar hospital walls now feeling cold and foreign. What happened now? She could feel the eyes of everyone around her, some sympathetic, some judgmental, all of them waiting for her to fall. When she reached the administrator's office, she was greeted by two of the hospital's senior managers, both stern-faced, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a woman with sharp features and cold eyes, spoke first. "We've been informed of your interference in the treatment of Ms. Hampton." Casey's throat tightened. "I was just trying to help." The woman's gaze sharpened. "This hospital has protocols in place, and you do not have the authority to question them. You've made things complicated." Casey's mind raced. Was this it? Would she be fired? Would her actions have destroyed everything she'd worked for? The woman leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "We need to discuss your future here. You may have just crossed a line that you can't come back from." Casey's hands were clammy as she sat in the cold, sterile office. The woman across from her, Ms. Reynolds, the hospital administrator, sat with her arms crossed, a stern look on her face. Her cold, calculating gaze bore into Casey, as though trying to decide if Casey was worthy of even the slightest consideration. Casey felt the weight of the room, heavy with expectation. The kind of expectation that only people with power and privilege could place on someone who was invisible. A maid, a nobody. "We've been informed of your interference in Ms. Hampton's care," Ms. Reynolds said again, her voice smooth but unyielding. "This is a serious breach of hospital protocol." Casey's throat tightened. She could feel the judgment in the air, the sense of impending punishment. She had only acted out of concern for Melania's well-being, but the system she was up against was one of power and authority, not compassion or justice. "I was just trying to help," Casey said, her voice steadier now. "Ms. Hampton needed someone to speak up. She's not just another patient in this hospital. She built an empire. She deserves better than to be treated like she's disposable." Ms. Reynolds didn't flinch at Casey's words. Instead, she glanced at her notes and then back at Casey with an air of disdain. "She doesn't need someone like you to speak for her. The staff here are more than capable of handling things without your interference." The words stung, but Casey didn't let them show. She knew the battle she was fighting wasn't just about Melania's care. It was about finding her own voice. She had spent years quietly cleaning up after people, but today, she wasn't going to fade into the background. Not anymore. Just as Ms. Reynolds was about to speak again, the door swung open with an abruptness that made both women turn. Melania Hampton stepped into the room, her presence as commanding as ever. The frail woman who had once built an empire now stood at the threshold, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "What's going on here?" Melania's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Ms. Reynolds' face stiffened, and Casey saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise. She wasn't used to someone like Melania, someone of such power, walking into her office. "Ms. Hampton, we were just discussing your care," Ms. Reynolds began, but Melania's sharp gaze stopped her mid-sentence. "I know what you were discussing," Melania said, her voice steady, with an undertone of authority that left no room for argument. "You were discussing my maid." Casey couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. Melania was stepping up for her, in a way that Casey never expected. It was surreal, and yet it felt like the only natural thing in the world. Ms. Reynolds cleared her throat and began to speak again. "Ms. Hampton, I understand your concern for Casey, but she is not in a position to make decisions regarding your care." "I don't care about your protocols," Melania interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "I care about my health, and I care about people who see me for who I am. Not just a patient, but someone who deserves respect." Casey could hardly believe what she was hearing. Melania was advocating for her. It was like a moment out of a dream. She had felt invisible for so long, but here was a woman with power, someone who had never once let anyone silence her. And now, Melania was standing up for her in a way she'd never imagined. "I know what you're trying to do," Melania continued, turning her gaze back to Ms. Reynolds. "And I won't stand for it. Casey has more courage than any of you in this room. She did what none of you could. She saw me, not as a frail old woman, but as someone who deserves dignity and care. And I'm not going to let you fire her or punish her for that." The room fell into an uneasy silence as Melania's words hung heavily in the air. Casey's mind was racing. Melania was standing up for her, and yet Casey knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback and there would be consequences. People didn't like to be challenged, especially those in power. But still, this was the moment that would change everything. Casey found her voice in the silence, stepping forward, her gaze steady. "Thank you, Ms. Hampton. I wasn't doing it for any reward. I just wanted to make sure you were taken care of. You've done so much for this world. You deserve the best. No one should be dismissed just because they're getting older." Melania smiled softly at her, her eyes softening just slightly. You're right, Casey. And you deserve the respect of this hospital, too. You've proven that you care. She turned her gaze back to Ms. Reynolds, her expression hardening again. I don't want to hear another word about this. Casey stays, and if you don't like it, you can leave. Casey felt a surge of pride swell in her chest as Melania's words rang in her ears. For the first time in a long time, she felt valued, seen, and respected, not for her position in life, but for the person she was. Minutes later, Casey stood outside the administrator's office, still trying to process everything that had just happened. The hospital, with all its rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules, had just been shaken. She had been seen, and Melania had used her influence to make sure Casey's place in this world wasn't dismissed. But it wasn't over yet. Casey's phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out, her heart dropping as she read the message. It was from the head of hospital administration. You're being called to a meeting tomorrow morning. The board wants to discuss your future here. Prepare yourself. Casey's pulse quickened. The battle wasn't over. As she read the message, Casey knew that her future in the hospital hung in the balance. The influence of Melania had bought her time, but there were still enemies within the system, enemies that would not take kindly to the change she was starting to stir. Would she be able to continue this fight, or would she be crushed by the weight of institutional resistance? What do you think? Casey stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, pale and unsure. The weight of the message she had just read hung heavily on her chest, constricting her breath. The board meeting. The pressure was mounting. It wasn't just about Melania's care anymore. It was about her own future and the changes she had started to make in a system that wasn't ready for it. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her back to reality. It was a message from Melania. Casey quickly opened it. You've got this. Stay true to what you believe in. They can't break you if you don't let them. Casey smiled faintly. Melania's unwavering support had been the one thing keeping her grounded. The woman who had once been a pioneer in a man's world, who had fought her way to the top, was now offering Casey the very same strength she had used to build her empire. With a deep breath, Casey stood taller. She couldn't back down. She wasn't just fighting for her job, she was fighting for dignity. However, later that day, Casey entered the hospital administration office, her heart pounding as the door closed behind her. Inside, the senior staff members were already seated around a large conference table. Ms. Reynolds, the cold hospital administrator, was the first to speak, her eyes narrow with disdain. Casey Doherty, Ms. Reynolds began, the tone in her voice dripping with sarcasm. You've caused quite a stir here. Casey stood her ground, but inside, she could feel the nerves creeping back in. She had never been in this kind of position before. The power in the room was palpable, and she could sense the unease from the staff members who sat there, knowing full well that Casey had broken the unspoken rule. She had stepped outside her role. We've had complaints, Ms. Reynolds continued, flipping through a stack of papers in front of her. You've overstepped, and you've disrupted hospital protocol. I spoke up for what's right, Casey said firmly, her voice steady despite the anxiety coursing through her. She could feel the pressure rising in her chest, but she refused to shrink back. I did what I had to do for Ms. Hampton. I did what none of you bothered to do, treat her with respect, like a person, not a statistic. Ms. Reynolds glared at Casey, clearly irritated by her defiance. This is not about respect, Casey. This is about your role here. You are a maid. You're not in a position to make decisions about the health of the patients. And you certainly have no place questioning the doctor's expertise. Casey clenched her fists, but she held her ground. I've seen enough to know when something's wrong. I wasn't doing it for attention or to make trouble. I was doing it because Ms. Hampton deserves better. There was a brief silence before another member of the administration spoke up. "You're making a mockery of the hierarchy, Casey." His voice was cold, his tone laced with a clear warning. "The hospital runs on a chain of command. You've disrupted that, and you've made a very powerful person very upset in the process." Casey's heart raced. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of the system threatening to suffocate her. But Melania's words echoed in her mind. "Stay true to what you believe in." Casey wasn't about to let her fears dictate her future. "I'm not here to be invisible anymore," she said with newfound resolve. "I will not apologize for doing the right thing." Ms. Reynolds' face hardened. "We'll be keeping an eye on you. Don't think this is over." Casey didn't respond, but her resolve was solid. She had made her choice. She would stand her ground, no matter the cost. Casey left the administration office with her head held high, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed her through the halls of the hospital. She had made her stand, but at what cost? Her mind was still swirling with the meeting when she received another message from Melania. "There are always consequences when you challenge the system, but I believe in you. Don't let them break you." Casey smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the support behind her. It wasn't just Melania who believed in her. It was time she believed in herself. The following days were filled with tension. Casey noticed the way the medical staff interacted with her, cold, distant, dismissive. The nurses didn't make eye contact, and the doctors spoke to her as though she were invisible again. The hospital had turned on her, and the sense of isolation was suffocating. But Casey didn't waver. Her conviction only grew stronger. She was no longer just a maid. She was someone who could make a difference. The way she looked at patients had changed. No longer was she just an observer. She was now someone fighting for what was right. It wasn't just about Melania anymore. It was about the future of the hospital, about dignity and respect for every person who walked through these doors. Casey's shift had ended, and she was making her way to the employee exit when her phone buzzed again. It was a message from a friend in the hospital. "You better be careful. Word is they're digging into your past." Casey froze. Her heart dropped into her stomach as she read the message again. Her past? She had been trying so hard to keep her past hidden. The struggles, the mistakes she had made. She wasn't proud of them, but they were hers. If the hospital administration was digging into her history, it wouldn't take long before they found out. What would they do with that information? As the weight of the message settled on her chest, Casey knew the stakes were rising. Her fight was just beginning, but enemies within the system were already preparing to strike back. And now, they had ammunition. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for everyday, heartfelt stories. Casey could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her as she sat in the break room, her fingers trembling slightly as she stared at the pile of paperwork in front of her. The hospital had become a battleground. Every decision, every move she made felt like it was under intense scrutiny. The systems, the people, the very walls of the place seemed to be closing in, trying to shut her down. But she wouldn't let them. She had seen enough over the years. The way the system treated the vulnerable, the way power and privilege shut people out, the way patients and staff alike were dehumanized by a system that valued efficiency over dignity. It had all started with Melania, but now Casey had a bigger mission: to reshape the way things were done. The fight for dignity was just beginning. Casey stood up, took a deep breath, and gathered the notes in front of her. Today was the day she would present her proposal for patient dignity reforms to the board, a plan that included cultural sensitivity training, equal treatment for all patients, and a push for more compassionate care in the system. She couldn't do it alone, but she had Melania's unwavering support. Melania, the woman who had fought for everything she had, who had never let anyone dismiss her, was now standing with Casey. Melania had become more than just an advocate. She was Casey's mentor, guiding her through the maze of politics, power, and privilege. They had spent hours together, going over reforms, strategizing how to break down the walls of resistance. You can't change a system by fighting against it head-on, Melania had told her, her voice calm but filled with the weight of experience. You have to break it down from the inside, piece by piece. Start with the small things. Treat people like people, not numbers. Respect. That's where you start. At first, Casey hadn't understood. She had been so focused on the big fight, on winning the war, that she had missed the subtle power of small victories. But now, as she prepared her presentation, she understood. Melania's wisdom had become her guiding light. It wasn't about power, it was about compassion. Casey walked into the conference room, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the risks. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the moment when her future at the hospital would either be solidified or torn apart. The board members had been skeptical of her ideas from the beginning. They didn't like change, didn't like challenges. They didn't like someone like Casey, someone who had come from nothing, someone who had never followed the rules. But Casey wasn't about to back down. She stood at the front of the room, her notes in front of her, the eyes of the board members trained on her. They sat with their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. But Casey didn't falter. She had a mission. This was her chance to show them that what they had been doing wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just treat the rich and powerful with respect while the rest were left to fend for themselves. "Thank you for your time today," Casey began, her voice steady despite the storm of nerves swirling inside her. "I'm here to discuss the importance of respect. Respect for all patients and staff, regardless of their background, their wealth, or their position. We all deserve to be treated with dignity." The room was silent. Casey could see the skeptical looks on the faces of the board members, but she didn't let them intimidate her. She continued, "The current culture at this hospital has created an environment where patients are dismissed, where staff are overlooked, and where respect is reserved for those with the most power. It's time for a change." She could see the discomfort on some of their faces now. They weren't used to being challenged like this. But Casey wasn't backing down. "We need to create a culture where dignity is at the core of everything we do. I propose we implement cultural sensitivity training for all staff, ensure every patient is treated with respect, and create a system where nobody is treated as disposable." There was a pause. The tension in the room was thick. Casey could hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat, the silence of the boardroom pressing in on her. Would they listen? Just as she was about to speak again, the door swung open, and another board member entered, the CEO of the hospital. She was a tall woman with a severe expression, her presence commanding the room instantly. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. "Are we seriously discussing cultural sensitivity at this level?" Casey felt her heart race, but she didn't waver. "Yes, we are. Because it's time for change." The CEO raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything immediately. She crossed her arms and waited for Casey to continue. Casey's nerves steadied as she continued to speak, the words flowing more confidently now. This was her fight. This was what she had been building toward. She was no longer just a maid. She was someone who could make a difference. Her voice mattered. Casey sat in her office, the meeting over, her body still buzzing with adrenaline. The room felt oddly quiet now, as if the world outside had suddenly faded into a soft hum. She had said her piece. She had stood up for what she believed in. But there was one thought that kept repeating in her mind. Had they heard her? Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Melania. "You did well today, but stay vigilant. Not everyone will be as open to change as you think." Casey smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. Melania's support had been everything. But just as she was about to respond, a new message popped up on her phone. It was from an unknown number. "Stop challenging the status quo. You have no idea what you're messing with. Stay in your place." The message was brief, but it chilled Casey to the bone. Who was this? And what did they know about her? The battle for respect was far from over. Casey's actions had already made her enemies within the system. And now, someone was threatening her in the shadows. Would she be able to continue her fight, or would the forces working against her tear her down before she could succeed? Casey walked down the hallway with her heart pounding in her chest. Her new office, now hers for the first time, felt strangely unfamiliar. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The day she would rise up, change the system, and make a real impact. But now that it had actually arrived, she felt the weight of it, the weight of responsibility. Her promotion to manager of patient care and cultural sensitivity had come after months of hard work and resistance. It hadn't been an easy road, and it wasn't like she had won everyone over. Some of the senior staff still looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and disdain, but Melania's support had been invaluable. Melania had fought for her, not only in the boardrooms, but in the hospital's darkest corners. Casey was here now because Melania believed in her. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was a small office, but it felt like a new beginning, a chance to make real change. Casey stepped inside and placed her bag on the desk. The pile of paperwork from her first week's meetings lay in front of her, and there was a brief moment of unease. This wasn't just a desk job. It was a chance to shape the future of this hospital. The culture of this place had been stagnant for too long, and Casey was determined to upend it. She took a deep breath and sank into the chair, running her fingers through her hair. The walls seemed to close in as the weight of her decisions pressed down on her again. She had always wanted to be part of the change. She had always believed in respect and dignity for everyone. But now, the task ahead felt even bigger than she had anticipated. How would she make it work? How could she change something so deeply ingrained in the system? Casey's phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Melania. "You're doing well, Casey. Keep pushing forward. Remember, leadership isn't about having power. It's about having the courage to lead with compassion." Casey smiled softly as she read the message, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Melania's words were always exactly what Casey needed to hear, no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed. Weeks later, the hospital was beginning to change. Casey had worked tirelessly with the staff, organizing workshops on cultural sensitivity, holding discussions on patient dignity, and implementing new patient care protocols. It wasn't easy, especially with the resistance she faced from some of the senior doctors, but small victories were being won every day. The staff were slowly starting to see that the changes were about more than just rules. They were about humanity. Respect. Casey was beginning to feel the power of her new position. She was no longer just a maid. She was a leader. Patients were being treated differently now. No longer did they feel like they were just numbers on a chart, ticking boxes for a doctor's schedule. They were being seen for who they were, human beings deserving of care and compassion. The nurses were starting to smile more at the patients. The doctors were engaging with the families. It wasn't perfect. Change never was, but Casey could see the impact. It wasn't long before the word began to spread. Casey's efforts were being noticed, and even the board members couldn't ignore it any longer. There were fewer complaints, and the hospital was beginning to build a reputation for being more than just a place to receive care. It was becoming a place where people were treated with dignity and respect. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, Casey knew the fight was far from over. There were still whispers in the hallways. Not everyone was happy with her rise to power. There were still senior staff members who resented her boldness, who thought she was nothing more than an upstart. But for the first time, Casey felt ready for the battle. One afternoon, Casey sat in her office, reviewing some patient feedback forms when she received a call from Melania. "Casey, how's everything going?" Melania's voice was calm, as always, but there was an undercurrent of concern. "It's going well," Casey replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We've made a lot of progress. The staff's response has been better than I expected. I'm proud of you. You're doing great things. But remember, there's more to leadership than just the immediate changes. It's about continuing to fight for what's right, even when the system tries to push back." Casey nodded, even though Melania couldn't see her. "I know, there's still a long way to go, but I won't stop." "Good. Don't let anyone make you think you're not worthy of being here. You earned it." The words settled in Casey's heart like a balm. Melania was right. She had earned this position. She had earned the right to speak up, to make a difference, to be heard. And no one, no matter their status, would be allowed to take that away from her. As the days went by, Casey's new role continued to evolve. She was more than just a leader now. She was a force for change. Her influence continued to grow, and the hospital's culture began to reflect the values she had worked so hard to instill. But even as things seemed to improve, Casey couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was just beginning. The more she pushed for reform, the more she realized just how deeply the system was entrenched. Old power structures were still in place, and not everyone in the hospital was ready to embrace the changes she was championing. She had made an enemy of some of the old guards, and she could feel their eyes on her every time she walked through the halls. Casey's phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her stomach tightening. "This is your final warning. Stop pushing these reforms, or you'll regret it." Casey's blood ran cold as she listened to the ominous words. Who was behind this? And more importantly, how far would they go to stop her? Casey stood in front of the window in her new office, looking out at the city skyline. The hospital had become a different place, a place she had shaped, a place where patients were treated with dignity and staff were respected. But despite all the changes she had fought for, the looming question remained: who had threatened her? The anonymous warning from the phone call still echoed in her mind. "Stop pushing these reforms, or you'll regret it." It had been a stark reminder that the battle was far from over. She had seen resistance from the old guard, the ones who thrived in a system that valued power over compassion, but she hadn't let it deter her. The hospital was better now, but the fight for change had cost her more than she had ever imagined. She had faced opposition from within, had been branded a troublemaker, and had seen the cold side of an institution that didn't like being challenged. But she had pushed through. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Melania. "You've done it. You've changed the game. You've proven that the real power lies in compassion, not authority. Don't ever forget who you are. You were always meant for more." Casey smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Melania had been right. This wasn't about taking down the old system. It was about building something better, something more humane. Casey had learned to lead not through power, but through integrity. A few days later, the hospital boardroom felt different this time. The familiar faces of the administrators, doctors, and staff who had once looked at Casey with disdain now greeted her with respect. She had earned it. Her proposal for system-wide reforms had been approved. Cultural sensitivity training was being implemented across departments. The focus on patient dignity had become a priority, and Casey was now in charge of overseeing these changes. The room was filled with murmurs of approval as Casey stood before them, now confident, no longer the invisible Maid she had once been. The walls that had once felt like barriers now seemed like they were breaking down. Ms. Reynolds, the hospital administrator who had once tried to shut her down, stood to speak. "Casey, we never imagined the kind of impact your leadership would have. We were wrong about you. You've transformed this hospital, and we're starting to see the long-term benefits of the changes you've made." Casey's heart swelled. The respect she had fought for was finally being given freely. She had earned her place. She had earned the right to make a difference, not just for herself, but for every patient, every staff member, and every person who had ever felt invisible. Later that day, Casey was walking out of the boardroom when she spotted Melania waiting for her outside the door. She looked even more radiant than usual, her silver hair glowing under the bright lights of the hallway. She smiled warmly at Casey, and for a moment, it felt like the world had finally aligned. "You did it," Melania said, her voice filled with pride. "I knew you would. I always knew." Casey felt a lump form in her throat. Melania had been her rock. She had shown her what it meant to stand tall, to lead with courage, and to never settle for being invisible. "I couldn't have done it without you," Casey said, her voice thick with emotion. "You believed in me when no one else did. You showed me what true leadership looks like." Melania placed a hand on Casey's shoulder. "You did the work, Casey. You fought for this. You fought for people who don't have a voice. You didn't just change this hospital. You changed me, too." She smiled. "And now, you've changed the world." A week later, Casey's work had caught the attention of healthcare professionals from all over the country. She had received invitations to speak at conferences, to join discussions about systemic healthcare reform, and even had offers from international organizations looking to bring her expertise to a global scale. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. She was no longer just a maid who had risen through the ranks. She was a recognized leader in the field of healthcare reform. Her vision of compassionate care was spreading, and people were starting to take her seriously. One evening, as she walked through the hospital lobby, she spotted a young nurse working late at the information desk. The nurse looked up and smiled at Casey. "Thank you." Casey blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For everything you've done. I'm not sure I could have stayed in this job if things hadn't changed. You've made it better for all of us." Casey smiled back, her heart lifting. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about people, real people whose lives were being affected by the decisions she had made. A few days later, Casey stood before a room full of journalists, ready to give her first official press conference as a leader in healthcare reform. The atmosphere was buzzing with anticipation. She had come so far. Her journey from the invisible maid to a woman leading a national movement for change was no longer just a dream. She took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The cameras flashed, but Casey didn't flinch. She smiled, knowing that this moment had been years in the making. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice calm but strong. "Today is not just about me. It's about all of us standing together to create a system that values dignity, respect, and care for every person, no matter who they are or where they come from." Casey paused, her words carrying the weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had fought for. "This is just the beginning," Casey continued. "Together, we can build a future where every patient feels valued, where every staff member feels respected, and where healthcare is about more than just treatment. It's about humanity." As the press conference ended, Casey stepped off the stage, feeling the eyes of the world on her. She had transformed the hospital system, but now the world was watching to see if she would transform healthcare on a global scale.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.